The Books Podcast, presented by Tim Hague.
Alfred Nobel, the inventor of dynamite, said that once two armies could utterly and instantly destroy each other, mankind would recoil in horror from the prospect and war would be obsolete. He turned out to be wrong about that, as the advent of atomic bombs showed. It does rather look as though fighting is hardwired into the human brain. Dr. Nicholas Wright has skin in the game. He's a neuroscientist and also an advisor to the Pentagon in America and the Ministry of Defense, who turned to him for advice on how the very architecture of the brain deals with conflict and what that means for our prospects of winning wars, or at least not losing them.
Your brain, for example, Tim, works on the wattage of a dim incandescent light bulb. We are the only primates that teach. Even in 1952, a quarter of Germans still had a good opinion of Hitler. There were very senior French generals bursting into tears because there was just no plan. You can put in an array of electrodes within a rodent's brain, and you can read out precisely where that rodent is in the real world just by reading out where is activated in their hippocampus. So it's literally a map of the world. War does make sense.
I ask you, gentlemen of the jury, is this the kind of book you'd like your wives and servants to read?
Nick, thank you for joining us on Books Podcast.
Tim, thank you so much for having me.
Right at the beginning of this book, you quote Steven Pinker to the effect that it's all going to be okay because the arc of history tends toward peace and war is irrational. But it's not, is it? War, in fact, makes sense. Or does it? No, I want to make that a question. Does war make sense?
As always, I think that Pinker is partly right, or rather I think he's not wrong, but I think his answer is dangerously incomplete, because war can make sense. If you think about why Britain went to war and France went to war in September 1939 when Hitler's Germany invaded Poland, there is no doubt that being nicer to Adolf Hitler was not going to work. We had to go to war, or we would not have stopped him taking over as much of Europe as he wanted to and beyond, and painting a pitch black future for very many of us. So war does make sense, because there will always be figures like Hitler who deliberately want to go to war. There will always be Bin Ladens. There will always be Putins. And sometimes we need to fight them.
Well, this pitches us straight into one of your main themes, which is that, of course, we can't always know. And you make one of the great things about the book is that you're also, I don't know if you're actually a military historian, but you use examples from real military history to make your points. And you say that we always have to ask ourselves, are we in the run-up to the First World War or the run-up to the Second World War? You've mentioned the Second World War there, where we had to fight. But there's a distinction. We don't always know which one we're in.
I mean, you're absolutely right. And so I'm not a military historian, but I've worked in history and with military historians for many years. And I got my book double-checked, my homework marked by Lawrence Friedman and other really wonderful military historians. So, although he endorsed the book, having read it. So you're absolutely right. And this is a fundamental challenge for humans, and not just states, but just humans who might be living in a tribe or wherever we are. And it's incredibly difficult to work out somebody else's intentions, what it is that they want to do. Now, we have in our brains remarkable brain machinery, neural machinery, for trying to work out others' intentions, for modelling others, for making models of what others are planning to do. And one of the great challenges is, as you said, are we in the run-up to World War I, or are we in the run-up to World War II? In the run-up to World War II, Hitler really wanted to go to war, and he was deliberately going to war. He was going to escalate to war, and the way we were going to effectively counter that was to be much tougher to begin with, to deter him from making some actions, and by preparing to fight. That's what we needed to do in the run-up to World War II. The problem is that in the run-up to World War I, none of the great powers in Europe really wanted to go to war. Yes, some powers are more to blame than others, but none of them really wanted to go to war, certainly not the general European cataclysm that occurred. And so there, the answers were broadly around being less militaristic, being less aggressive. The problem is that, are we in the run-up to World War I now, for example, over China? Or are we in the run-up to World War II? Should we be being nicer to China, or does Xi Jinping, and he has the power to do this, does he want to just simply press the metaphorical button and decide he wants to invade Taiwan? It's difficult for us to know. We have to do our best to try and work out those intentions of the other. We have amazing neural machinery for doing that, and amazing intelligence apparatus and all the rest of it for doing that. But there is always an absolutely irreducible uncertainty, and that's at the heart of, or one of the very many reasons about the brain that drives humans towards war.
Well, before we talk about the neurology and what I describe as the sort of the architecture of the brain, which you do in quite a lot of detail, I want to establish your bona fides. You are a neuroscientist, and you also have this sideline, I think it is, of advising military people.
Well, I mean, it's not so much a sideline anymore.
It must be fascinating, though, finding out how the military mind thinks.
Yeah, I mean, I hope it's changed my understanding of the world. It's one of the main reasons I wrote this book was because I saw that they were really worried that now times have changed. We really could lose, and that's something that most normal people, why would they? Most normal people in other walks of life just don't know about, and that's really vital. We could lose in our time. We could lose a conventional war. They know about that, and we don't. And it has changed my understanding of the world working with them.
I think one of the apprehensions of at least the thinkers in the West is that the complacency of the West is such that we do expect to come through these things, and some of our enemies are looking and going, these people are weak. They're not up for it. They don't have the determination.
Look. If I had to choose which position to be in, I would rather be us than them, right? I think we are still extremely powerful countries, right? America, Britain, France, right? Very, very powerful countries in lots of different ways. And in addition to that, we are no longer overwhelmingly powerful. So to give you just one sort of crucial fact about China, for example, that most people don't know. So China now produces more manufacturing output than the next 4 or even 9 countries in the world combined, right? China dominates drone manufacturing, and obviously drones are crucial for war. They now have not only do they have an enormous number, about 150 million industrial workers, they have more robots per 1,000 manufacturing workers than any G7 country. Their manufacturing is not just huge, it's in many ways, certainly in some ways, more sophisticated than what you get in Britain or America or Germany or Japan or France, right? Now, when we come up against them, we're going to have to use our brains because it is absolutely not certain that we're going to have any really significant material advantage.
One of your brilliant examples in the book is the fall of France. You were talking about America, France, Britain still being very powerful countries. And in the Second World War, France was deemed to be this military. And yet Hitler's forces had no problem. They swept France aside in days. And that's it illustrates one of your central ideas, doesn't it? Which is prediction error. So can we sort of dial down into that? Tell us about prediction error and how that works.
So you're absolutely right. In the Battle for France on May the 10th, 1940. Right, the defenders of France, that's Britain and France, they had more planes, more trained men, more tanks, more guns, right? And they weren't worse things in many ways, and often they were better than what the Germans had. But the Germans combined those technologies of their time with aspects of how the human brain works to create really powerful effects in what they called the Blitzkrieg, or what has been rather called the Blitzkrieg. And one of the key things, so one of the pioneers of that Blitzkrieg is a chap called Heinz Guderian, and he wrote a book. We could have just read his book because he published it before...
19... I read in your book.
Before the war. And one of the 3 key principles he had in there was surprise. Okay, and surprise will always matter in warfare. And the reason for that is that it's just that surprise is a fundamental aspect of how human brains work at essentially every level, all the way through your brain, all the way from the brainstem right at the very bottom of your brain, all the way through to the frontal pole, the most sophisticated part of our brain, the most distinctively human part of the brain at the other end. And so throughout all of those different brain systems, we use models of the world, right? And by that, a model is simply a process for linking. It's a way of linking senses coming in to actions that we can take that help us achieve our goals. But we have to use these models because there is just simply too much information constantly pouring in for us to just look at the world and see it on some kind of passive television set. We use these models of the world that constrain what we're doing. And these models of the world constantly make predictions about the world. They're constantly anticipating things that will be useful for us to be doing to achieve our goals, things like surviving and winning and so on. Now, how do we know when our models are wrong? How do we know when we need to change our models? When there's actually a tank coming down the road, or a tank crossing the river, or a car that is careering out of control, or whatever it might be. We change our models of the world when the predictions that model makes, right, the predictions are wrong. When there's a violation of our expectations, right? And that error in our predictions, that prediction error, is an amazingly powerful learning signal. And it tells us, guys, stop for a second and change your model of the world. Do something. Something important is happening. We need to change.
But this can be a good thing or a bad thing. If you've got a sort of robust expectation and your model changes, then you'll develop a different strategy. What happened to France is that the morale collapsed and that France gave in.
Yeah.
It didn't say, "Oh, things have not gone as well as we expected. We must do this." They collapsed.
And that's really important. So if you are able, exactly, how do you deal with prediction error? So at the level of frontline troops, there was a key area of the front around Sedan. And they had put a lot of their poorest trained troops there. Training turns surprises and uncertainty from something that can paralyze you into something that you can learn from and adapt to and react effectively towards. So training is crucial. And one of the key problems for the French in that area of the front was that the generals and so on, they were very slow at reacting. They did not communicate well with others. They had very sclerotic decision-making processes. And as a consequence, there were literally very senior French generals bursting into tears. And there's a famous scene where a British general grabs a Frenchman by the buttons of his tunic and shakes him because there was just no plan. They had no way to react because they hadn't thought through lots of different possible options, so they could on the fly come up with counters to what the Germans had done. Whereas the Germans, on the other hand, they used war games, they planned things out, they thought through different contingencies, and they were just better at making smarter decisions. And in World War II, Britain learnt from that, and we became much better. After World War II, we copied a lot of central tenets of that. So did the Americans. And to this day, we've learnt those lessons. And that's one of the reasons why we now have very effective militaries.
But we also had some very flexible people. You talk about Eisenhower and Churchill, Montgomery and George C. Marshall. I mean, you talk about all of these people in the book and how they developed their ability to respond to these problems. It's not actually... It's not a book strictly of military history. The way you structure the book, of course, is that you take us through the brain, bit by bit, area by area. Is that just a device to allow you to talk about the various functions? Or does it matter? Does the topography and the geography of the brain matter? Would our human responses be different if it was differently distributed?
I mean, that's an absolutely great question, Tim. The answer is yes. But obviously I need to elaborate on that. So what's in charge in the book is the brain. It's the brain, and it's the journey through the brain, which goes from the brainstem right at the base, which does really core things like pain, for example, and breathing and circulation, but also sends up powerful chemicals like noradrenaline and dopamine that can gird us for a fight. So it starts there, and then it moves up through many different brain regions, and you start adding on things like emotions, right? Things like fear. Fear is useful, and it adds those on. And then you move up through to our most sophisticated capabilities for sensing the world, for perceiving, and for acting. So you can be a samurai warrior who's able to wield a blade with incredible precision. And then on to what comes between sensation and action, which we can call thinking, right? And that's really important. So, like, what makes humans distinctively human is in many ways our ability to think. And that comes between sensation and action. And it goes all the way through to, as I said, the frontal pole, this bit right at the very other end of the brain, which does our most sophisticated thinking. And that is thinking about our own thinking.
Metacognition, you call it.
Exactly.
Yes. Tell me about that.
So metacognition, or thinking about our own thinking, is really quite remarkable. So, and we've learned so much about this really over only the last sort of 15, 17 years. And we've learned about how it happens in the brain and how we can enhance it in all of us as well. So metacognition is thinking about our own thinking. And that enables us, for example, to make a decision and then think, well, how confident am I in that decision, right? Was that the right move for me to make? Or should I have made that move?
Because a mouse will have all of these functions, but he won't be able to say, maybe that was a bad idea.
Exactly. Now, mice can actually simulate things within their brains. So we know, for example, that they can simulate different... So in the brain of a mouse and in the brain of a human, in the hippocampal entorhinal cortex, and this is a great illustration of how these models are really existing models. They're not metaphors, they're really in there. So a mouse can have a map of the world. Now, we all have these maps. And so what you can do is you can put in an array of electrodes within a rodent's brain, and you can read out precisely where that rodent is in the real world just by reading out where is activated in their hippocampus. So it's literally a map of the world. Now, rodents can do that. We can now do lots of clever recordings from rodents, and we can see that they can sweep forwards, for example, and think their way through mazes. And you can actually watch this on the internet.
And you can watch it as it happens.
Yeah, and it's really quite remarkable. But humans can do something different, and this is where our metacognition comes in. Because what we can do, which is really quite spectacular, is we can explicitly ask ourselves, how should I be thinking about this? And we can also ask ourselves, for example, is this even the right goal that I should be aiming for? So, and this is a crucial distinction, and this is so important because there are lots of clever people in the world, right? And there are lots of clever things in the world, but there is a distinction between being clever and being wise. So wisdom is seeing the bigger picture about ourselves in the world so that we can choose better actions that help us achieve our goals, right? That's what it is. And we're finding out so many different aspects of how that type of wisdom works in the brain. And that central to that is our ability to think about our own thinking. And that was central to ancient Chinese philosophy. It was central to, the philosophy, the ideas of Socrates was central to, it was on the Temple of Delphi, know thyself. But now we're finding out much more how humans actually do it, and how we can enhance that in ourselves. And that can help us be wiser.
And this is one of the things that you're doing with the Pentagon, isn't it? And with the Department of Defense is exploring with them how they can see the bigger picture more clearly.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the things. So we all, I have, blinders and blind spots when I think about things, when I act. And that's inevitably the case because I'm a human. I have a human brain, and you, Tim, have a human brain. Every listener out there has a human brain. So sometimes we need to stop and say, is this the right thing? Okay. And how can we interrogate our own thinking better? And so, for example, I just finished up, whilst I was writing the book, I spent quite a lot of that time every week or two having a meeting with people who work on nuclear weapons strategy for the American military. And, one of the key things that I talked about there was, what are these challenges they face when they're making plans for the future and when they're trying to think about how adversaries might make plans? And how can they interrogate their own thinking better? How can they make wiser choices? And when you're dealing with something like nuclear weapons, one can laugh and say, they need to be whatever. But we need to make wiser choices because this is, climate change is important. Pandemics are important. I'm not minimizing lots of other challenges we face as a society. But the only thing that can kill, half the population of the world tomorrow afternoon and the other half, a few months later, in all likelihood, is nuclear weapons, right? We have to make wiser choices. There's no simple way to deal with that challenge. We have to think in a more rounded way and see the bigger picture about ourselves and the world.
Psychologists have always pointed out that the human brain can only deal with a certain amount of information, and have always presented it as sort of a limitation. We have to make these compromises. I almost got the impression from your book that it can be regarded as an advantage, because it forces us to select, and it forces us to reflect upon things.
That's a really good point. I mean, we have to remember that your brain, for example, Tim, works on the wattage of a dim incandescent light bulb.
It has
right?
been said many times,
but that's not because it's
not neurosurgeons.
But that's because all of us do, right? It's about the brain is hugely limited. It's enormously powerful. It's enormously creative, but it is inherently limited. And you are absolutely right that in some ways, like one of the things that makes me optimistic about the future, and I am optimistic, is that we can, for example, make wiser choices, make better choices using this incredible machinery, this brain machinery we have, and that can be enhanced. There is no machine ever that could calculate everything that could possibly happen in the world. There is no, you probably only Douglas Adams and the computer that can, that can think exactly, that can work at everything. That can never, or Earth, as it turns out to be, that can never happen, because you get combinatorial explosion, right? Me thinking of you, thinking of me, thinking of you, and in a game of Go, and already it becomes, the explosion is enormous. But then actually the real world is even more complex than that. Because, for example, imagine you are, and there are lots of people I know who were on the National Security Council in the US, for example, thinking about Ukraine, right? Mm-hmm. So you could be the US thinking about the Russians, thinking about the US, thinking about the Russians, and already that can explode into a vast decision tree of potential options. But that's not the only thing they need to think about. They also need to think about Ukraine is just one theatre in a much broader global system.
They also need to think about the implications if Putin gets away with it.
Exactly. So what are the games we're playing? What is the battleground on which we're actually trying to work out the best options? It is impossible to do any of this by brute force. And we need, therefore, even with our remarkable brains that are so good at doing this, we need wisdom, and we need to balance different really important priorities. And that will always be the case, right? And if you look at someone, as you mentioned Eisenhower, right? There was somebody who recognized the limitations of himself and his country and made really wise decisions. He basically in the early Cold War, when he was the US president, and he set the US up for what he described as the long haul, right? So the US would be a coherent, stable society. It would push back where it could, and it will be prepared for that long haul, right? It will be resilient to shocks. And we need some of that wisdom now.
Well, can I take you back? The subtitle of your book is How the Brain Shapes War and War Shapes the Brain. Can I take you to the second part of that chiasmus? Yeah. How plastic is the brain? Does the actual structure of it change?
Yes.
In response to warfare?
Yeah. I mean, inevitably, it's nature and nurture. Because everyone hears this, and everyone's like, oh, is it all nature or nurture? Inevitably, the answer is it's some nature and some nurture. Right? Everyone in the world has broadly the same basic structure of their brain. So I've looked, for example, I've done experiments in China, and we've done experiments in Iran, and comparing people in Iran and China to Britain and America and so on. And I've done a lot of reviews of the literature and so on for the Pentagon. And the gist is that cultural commonalities, right, outweigh cultural differences. But there are differences in the brain, and our brains are remarkably plastic, right? They can change. So to give you an example, humans have a remarkable spiral, right? Which is one of the main reasons why, we can get people to the moon and chimps can't. Mm-hmm. And that's because we are the only primates that teach.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that.
We are the only primates
Other animals learn. We know that they learn. because you can watch them doing it. But teaching is a uniquely human activity.
It's not quite uniquely human, but it's unique amongst primates. Okay, so to give you an example, so a chimp, right, a baby chimp or a juvenile chimp might see its mother cracking some stones with cracking some nuts with a stone or whatever, and it can learn from that. But the mother is not spending resources to actively teach the juvenile. Whereas humans, we are incredible at teaching. Right, we go out of our way. Like I think about I teach my children all sorts of stuff, whether they want it or not. It's good for them. We go out of our way to teach, and we're also incredibly avid social learners. Right, humans are even better at learning, and it's this spiral. Great teaching, right? The importance of teaching enables us to learn more, which means that the value of teaching goes up, which means the value of learning goes up, and so on. And so, for example, in hunter-gatherer societies, humans only reach the peak of their hunting ability, not when they're like 18, 19-year-olds who are at the peak of their strength. That's not when we reach our peak. We reach our peak at about 40, right? And then later on in life, the reason why older people survive is that they then become repositories of knowledge that they can then teach and impart to others. And it's very interesting. So there are some examples of non-human animals that teach. One of my favorites is meerkats. So a meerkat, because it is valuable, it's worth teaching if you're a meerkat, because they have to deal with dangerous prey like scorpions. So what they will do with their pups is a meerkat will bring a scorpion with first of all, a dead scorpion. Right, so the younger meerkat can get used to it.
The only good scorpion. No, yeah. Okay.
Well, I was going to say, not if you're a scorpion. Then they bring a scorpion with the sting nipped off. Right, so again, the younger meerkat can get an idea of how it's going, and then finally they bring a live scorpion for the pup to. You give the pup a live scorpion, so it can do a live scorpion with its stinger on, and so it's worth it for them to do it, and it's worth it for us to do it. And our brains are so plastic; they can change so much, in large part because we can build this huge repertoire of skills that we can teach and learn.
And everybody knows that London cabbies who've done the knowledge have a larger hippocampus, don't they, than the rest of us?
A differently structured hippocampus. That's absolutely correct. And so, in fact, that lab, so Demis Hassabis, who won the Nobel Prize last year, he actually did his PhD research on that part of the brain, on the hippocampus, with Eleanor Maguire, who sadly passed away, actually, recently, who did pioneering work on cab drivers and showed that, yes, learning the knowledge, the idea, this huge geographical knowledge of essentially all the streets in central London and landmarks and how to get from A to B, that changed the structure of their brains compared to cab drivers who failed the test and and people who drove buses for a living and all the rest of it. So she did loads of really beautiful experiments, and this is very well established. And she really did, and she showed that, yes, our brains change. But then you can also, if I were to, I don't know if you can juggle, Tim, but if you could juggle, right? Or if you can't juggle.
Got a good friend who juggles.
Teaching you to juggle, and if I scan your brain before, during, and after you learn to juggle, right, your brain structure would be altered. Our brains change as we learn things, and that's a good thing.
You mentioned hunter-gatherers and social groups, and you can map primates of how many, what size of social group they're inclined to create. And what's weird about human beings is that we ought to be having groups of about 150, 250, and yet we form nations, which brings us back to war, of course. What is going on there? Because it's a development that must have been promoted by.
I mean, it must involve. The key to that is in our brains. So how do we do that? How can our brains enable us to get to the level of a tribe and a state and so on? Something that no other primate can do. And so again, this involves plasticity and this involves change. And so what our brains, the way we can form these coherent groups it's another spiral. And a lot of things about how the brain works is a spiral. What happens is that enough humans have coherent identities, right? They form a group with coherent enough identities to work together. And those are shaped by the culture of that group. So, and culture, we can have a long discussion about what culture is, but culture is essentially how things are done around here. And the identities help form the cultures, and the culture helps form the identities. And it's a spiral that creates groups of consistent enough humans that they can work together. And again, that's something that other animals, other primates can't do.
This is, again, a part of being able to look at ourselves, isn't it? You make a distinction. You've got a chapter in which you discuss embodied self, narrative self, and social self. And it's that social self, isn't it, that allows us to...
I wouldn't say it's just that. I'd say the narrative self is also very important. So the narrative self, the embodied self is that there is a Tim, and he's looking out at the world. Because
I know where my hand
you're not
is.
blind,
I know,
and you're looking out from somewhere behind your forehead or behind your, in the middle of your head, right? You're embodied. You're confident the bits of your body are your own. The narrative self is the story about your past, where you came from, how that fits into a narrative that makes you the person you are now, situates you in the present, and then that you can go forwards and see where the story of Tim's life may take you into the future, right? So that's your narrative self. And then the third part is the social self, which is, as you said, that's the them and us component, the in-group, out-group, right? This is how individuals of my group behave. And one of the things about forming any kind of in-group is that there was necessarily an out-group. There were others who were outside that group, right?
Them and us.
But it's very important to, and I think this is actually one of the ways that basically a better understanding of how ourselves, our answer to the question, who am I, how that actually works in the brain, it can provide, reasons for optimism moving forwards. So if we think about the narrative self, who was I, which makes me the man I am today and moving into the future for me as an individual. If we think about how we changed people who needed to change, right? So take active Nazis in 1945, surveying the rubble of Germany, obviously a disaster, right? But it actually took years to change their opinions. Right, it took years. So Germany lost in 1945, but opinion polls even up to 1949 consistently showed a majority of Germans believed that Nazism was a good idea, badly applied. Right, for years afterwards, and even in 1952,
like Brexit.
Well, I leave that to you to make that observation. Even at 1952, a quarter of Germans still thought that had a good opinion of Hitler, right? Now that obviously needed to, those ideas were, Nazism was extreme and it needed to change. Much more extreme than the vast majority of ideas people worry about in our society or in polarized American society today. And yet those ideas did change. And how was that? One of the key things is that the Germans, these active Nazis, were given ways to integrate elements of their past. Because if you tell someone, just everything in your past is bad, ignore everything from your past, they won't do that. You need to tell a narrative about your life and about how the past makes you the person you are today that can move into the future. And so they were given the opportunity to take elements of what they'd done, elements of their past, and build that into a narrative as constructive members of a conservative West Germany. As conservative West German society, in which they could have prestige by economic growth and building a coherent and ordered and good society, right? And so if we're thinking now, for example, about polarized British society or polarized American society or lots of the things people worry about, and again, it's much less extreme than that. A few things. Two things. One, it's going to take years to change people. We need to get a better grip of how long it's going to take to change, right? And I want us to try and come together, and I'm optimistic that we can do that, but it's going to take years to do that. And part of that is to create identities where the different groups who are antagonistic within society, we need to have a broad enough, a capacious enough identity that they can fit parts of their past in. If you're in America, if you're a MAGA supporter or you're a Black Lives Matter supporter, both of those people should be able to fit parts of their identity into what it means to be an American, for example. And that's very important.
Which is something that America used to be very good at. And it seems to have fractured. We we've shown enormous self-restraint and not discussed artificial intelligence, but we have to touch on it because, again, the book is circles around the notions of war and how war is going to need to be considered, and artificial intelligence is going to come in. When I say that, we're not talking about these large language models, are we? ChatGPT is not what we mean by artificial intelligence. Well, we mean something a bit more sophisticated.
It's one. Well, I mean, it is one. And just to say so, ChatGPT was absolutely mind-blowingly good. Mm-hmm. So, I vividly remember in around November 2022. And I was just absolutely blown away by how good ChatGPT was. So, there's this idea of the Turing test. So, can you have a conversation, etc. Yeah. Now, if you were the richest person in the world, you were Jeff Bezos, you could not, 5 years before that, no one in the whole world could have got something anywhere near as good as the ChatGPT that I could look at on my phone. Right? ChatGPT is really good, but it's just one of those types of artificial intelligence. And there are many different other types. And I've done a lot of work on AI with the Pentagon and so on, and those types of models are one component. And then, as with the brain, right, there's no one single model in our brain. We have many different models, all the way from the brainstem all the way through to the frontal pole. And the best way to think about our brain is in many ways as an orchestra of models. Right? Many different models that each do different things. And we need all of them. So we need the brass of our emotions, things like fear and anger. We need the violins of our most sophisticated forward thinking. We need the, percussion, the drums beating of dopamine and noradrenaline surging up. And we need the conductor of the orchestra, which is the frontal pole, the one who can think about our own thinking and say, up with the violins or down with the thing.
Yeah, this is the point. I mean, I may be hopelessly out of...
And just to say, that's what AI is going to require. Right? Well, it's going to require a suite of models, not just one.
You say in the book that understanding human intentions will be crucial because humans will increasingly tell computers what we intend to happen, but not how to achieve, not how to do it. My feeling is that AI has not got there yet. AI tends to...
I would love to agree with you. And so since I finished writing the book, since I finished writing the book, but before it was published, so a few weeks ago now, a couple of months ago, for the first time ever on the battlefield, and any battlefield, there was Ukraine used a group of drones, a small swarm, and the commander would give that swarm a target, and then that swarm would decide how it was going to conduct the mission, implement the mission to apply lethal force, so to kill people, right, destroy things. So that is now, that's happened. That's happened now, right? And that's just the very first part of it. That's just Ukraine, right? And I'm not saying just Ukraine because the Ukrainians have been an extremely brave country and they've done an, amazing, I have an enormous amount of respect for the Ukrainian armed forces and so on. So, but Russia and Ukraine are not top tier scientific nations. Right, what would happen in a US-China war, especially if it's prolonged, is far beyond anything that we're going to see on the battlefield of Ukraine, right? Now, but we're already seeing this, swarms of drones that can apply lethal force, right? And that's going to it will be swarm versus swarm. Now, how does a human tell that swarm what to do, right? So the human is not going to be sitting, as they say, in the loop, overseeing every decision that swarm is going to make, for the simple reason that, if it's a swarm that's working at human speed versus a swarm that can work at machine speed, the swarm where the human is going, oh no, Jim, wait till the enemy have done whatever, it's never going to win. So the human is going to sit on top of that swarm, right, metaphorically, and we're going to be telling them what we want that swarm to do, our intentions. And they are going to be communicating back what they're doing, how they are progressing. And there will be two-way communication between the human and the swarm of AI-controlled drones. And that communication is going to require understanding how humans communicate their intentions, how humans communicate, what information humans need from someone they're collaborating with in order to really succeed. And that's going to require understanding the humans just as much as it does the AI.
But are we not now into the territory of all those dysfunctional science fiction films in which the machines start to get self-reflective, start to develop purposes of their own? You offer an example of creatively finding solutions that are counterproductive. Although to be fair, people do that as well. But that's the point, isn't it? When people do, we sort of accept it as a human. A human province, a human capacity, but can artificial intelligence, can drones not bypass human limitations in war, and then decide that your example is if what we need is a lot more paper clips, the easiest way to do that is to kill the entire human race. And then we'll have all the paper clips we need.
Well, that is so. It's not that's a very famous example that people use in discussions on AI. But you're absolutely right. And what you've got there is so how does AI work? So AI essentially works because what you're doing is you give it some kind of objective, right? So a bit like remember I said about why do you have a brain? You have a brain, which is a process for linking senses coming in to actions that help you achieve your goals, right? That's why you, Tim, have a brain. Every listener out there has a brain for that reason. And that's basically what AI does, right? And the goal is something we specify for it. So, for example, there was as you said, that computer game. So there's a little, it had to control in a computer game. The AI had to control in a computer game a boat that had to go and go around a course and then win a race. But what the AI discovered was the best way to get points was actually to go into the middle of the course and then go round and round and round and round, crashing into things and burning and doing all sorts of stuff. But then there were flags that regenerated there, and it could get a 20% more high score than a human player, even though, of course, the point of the game was to find the fastest route to the end. It wasn't to spin around the middle, crashing into things. And so what can we, how can we think about the objective function? How can we specify things for AI that will make it do what we want it to do?
You say the human brain has these purposes. It's got a feedback, and then but the purpose of that process is to promote the interests of the organism. And what we're asking an AI to do is not to promote the interests of its own entity, but to promote the interests of our organism. So we're asking it to do something slightly to the side, slightly offset.
Well, that's why a lot of people would then say, so what we need to do is think about how to align the objectives, the objective function of this AI. We need to think how to align that to what we want humans to be doing, right? And now I don't think that's going to work for exactly the types of reasons you're talking about. I think it's very difficult. For example, what do humans want, right? What you want for the world and what I want for the world may be slightly different. And what Tim of today wants for the world might be different to the Tim of 5 years ago or 25 years ago or Tim of 10 years in the future. So I think it's really important that we remember that, it's going to be very difficult to program in whatever it is that we want as humans. So how can we do, what can we do instead? So I think what we can do instead is build an AI that is wiser, right? And already you talked about self-reflection in AI. DARPA and others are already building metacognition, thinking about thinking into AI. And that's enormously powerful at helping AI complete its tasks. And what we can do, I think, is make wiser AI, right? So for example, it can say, you said, if you set it the objective of making paper clips, it shouldn't to exclusively pursue that goal of paper clips. It should be able to think about its own thinking, reflect and say, what is the point of my life as an AI? It is not exclusively making paper clips, regardless of how many humans I destroy. And so don't too exclusively...
so the AI can say, well, I'm making paper clips because people need paper clips.
Yes. And that's another key thing. So, for example, there's a really, and this helps clarify, was Adolf Hitler wise? Right, he was certainly clever. And again, it gives me no pleasure to say that. He was certainly an effective communicator. And had he died in 1941, right, before the invasion of Russia, we could have said at that point he was very restrained. He worked his way up through the institutions of Germany. He worked his way through, and he won the Battle of France using his team and, taking on other people's opinions and using the best ideas of other people and so on. And we'd have said, well, mate, now I don't think he was wise, right? And one of the main reasons why I don't think he was wise is because he also didn't value human life. And I think that also, for me, there has to be one point about wisdom, which is not to exclusively pursuing any one single priority or any one single objective. But another thing is I think for me, morally, there has to be wise, there has to be a value for human life outside one's own group, right? Hitler did value the lives of Aryan people, but he should have valued the lives of many other groups of people as well. And so I think to get AI to be wise, we can build in a lot of the process, and we also need to add in that value of human
The
life.
morality worries me as well, because yes, you can say we could find a way of building morality into AI, but we can't agree about what morality is either between us.
You're right, we can't. And in my opinion, we never will be able to. And morality will always be slippery. But what we can do is we can work out. So we've got a wonderful set of lenses that we've got through philosophy over the last thousands of years in Western traditions, Indian, Chinese, many others, right? We have these, and it boils down to things like, for example, you've got consequentialists, so like utilitarianism, you look at outcomes and you try and choose which option will give you the best outcomes. Or you could have more deontological ideas, as like Immanuel Kant. So is this the right action to take or not? Okay. And then you've got a third set, which is about identity, which is about what would a virtuous person do in this circumstance. That's like Aristotelian. Now, we have those wonderful lenses from the past. And what we can now do is we can actually see, well, how do people make moral decisions in the brain? And they've now been studying this, in the laboratory, using a lot of hypothetical moral decisions, admittedly. But I think it still gives us good evidence. And what you can show is that the main finding for the neuroscience of human morality is that we use the same basic decision-making processes in the brain for morality as we use for other types of decisions, economic decisions, decisions about risks and rewards and punishments and so on, intentions. And so the reason why that's good, in my opinion, is that we're working out how humans can make decisions. We're working out the processes by which we make moral decisions. We're never going to work out perfectly how those decisions will be made, but we're working it out. We can now specify it mathematically. And then what we can do is we can start working those processes into AI. So when you have that swarm that's going to be working out what it's going to be doing, how it's going to apply lethal force, how it's going to kill people, and that can only ever be looked down upon by humans who will have to allow it to make lots of decisions, it will be able to have some kind of morality built into it. Will it be perfect? No, because human morality is not perfect and never can be. Its morality will never be perfect and never can be. But it's better than nothing, and it can make decisions that are reasonably moral. And of course, interestingly, from my perspective, that also opens a whole new thing of where do we, as the humans who control these AIs, where do we decide that they're, how do we decide that they should be executing their missions? What makes a mission conducted morally or not morally? And we're going to have to think about that in much clearer ways than I think we've ever had to before. And that's because, these AIs will be crystallizing how humans think about morality in their actions.
My final question was going to be, are you optimistic? But you've answered that question comprehensively. Yes, you are. Nick, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Tim.
The book is Warhead, How the Brain Shapes War and War Shapes the Brain by Dr. Nicholas Wright. It's published by Macmillan at £22. Subscribing to Books Podcast is free, so, well, you might as well. That way you'll be notified of each new show. Next time we'll be talking to the great Peter Doggett about Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys, which is a band whose history I'm not hugely familiar with. So just for once, Peter will be able to get a word in edgeways. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you so much.
That was the Books Podcast, presented by Tim Hague. Email Tim on tim@bookspodcast.com, Twitter @bookspodcast, and Facebook @bookspodcasttim.
I have to say, I always wanted to say about the Turing test. I always think people get the Turing test wrong. They treat it as though it's supposed to be, can you tell that this is a...
Yeah.
Surely what the Turing test is how we respond to it. If we can't tell the difference between it and a person, surely we should then be treating it as though it was a person. I think the Turing test is a test of humanity, not of AI, don't you? Or is that just fanciful of me?
No. I mean, I think you're right. But that doesn't also stop it being a test of the AI.
No, of course.
Do you see what I mean?
Right.
So
no, that's how it's intended. But it
the other thing is once you get into the nitty gritty of it, academically, because obviously the whole point about academics is to make it all very complicated, and I love doing that too. But so there's a whole thing about what does the Turing test actually mean? How many times? So, for example, if you do a blinded Turing test where I don't know whether I'm interacting with a human or a thing. So the way they got an AI to pass the Turing test a while ago was by saying, you are going to be interacting with a 17-year-old who doesn't have English as their first language. Right, this is how they did it before ChatGPT, essentially. And then some could just about pass the Turing test, right? So who are you interacting with and over what time frame? So, for example, I don't think there is no AI that could do... Even if you and I interacted by speaking, not I could see. For example, AI can't shuffle do what you're doing with the papers, right?
No,
robots are not. We're not very they can't fold a basket of clothing at the moment, right? That's the cutting edge of AI technology in terms of real world, like robotics. But there's nothing that could have done what you did today that I'm aware of, right? There's nothing that could have over an hour and 10 minutes or an hour and 15 minutes have chatted about random stuff downstairs in a socially appropriate fashion, had a bit of a discussion about what the podcast is, got a lot of nuance across, then asked these questions, interacted with me, done all of this stuff. There's nothing that could have done that in the whole world, right? So that is a much higher level. But then what if we get to that level? Then would it be I meet you 10 times and then I discover that you're actually an AI?
Oh, yes.
And I marry one. Yeah, no, but this is the thing. And so, no, but I mean, genuinely, because that is essentially what happened. That is what it's essential. Do Androids Dream of Electronic Sheep? I don't know if you read the original book.
Yeah, I did, yeah.
Which is a much darker, and what happens in Blade Runner is, I remember my wife was like, because I was like, Blade Runner is a great film. It's different to the book. And then my wife was like, she'd only read the book. And she was like, that film has got nothing to do with the book at all, really, beyond the basics.
That's true.
But you're absolutely right. And so when they get down to what the Turing test is that there are so many layers or levels. But I think the important thing that really, ChatGPT is, people are really negative on it now. But as I said, you could have been Jeff Bezos sitting under your volcano on a desert island or whatever, and you could not have had something as good as the ChatGPT I have on my phone right now. And that is pretty remarkable.
It is incredible. Yeah. Sinister, but incredible.
It is, and exciting. I don't know. As you know, I am an optimist.